The process of respiration, that is another life process. Previously we discussed about digestive systems. Now the respiration. The energy required by cells to perform its activity, that is derived obviously by oxidation of the food. Food is the source of energy, we know that. But that has to be converted into the form of energy, isn't it? And that is why the process of respiration is necessary. It is the process of releasing energy from food. That is what we call it as respiration. The process of respiration will include the intake of oxygenated air into the cell, that is inspiration or else the inhalation. Whereas the second would be the using of that oxygen for releasing energy by oxidation of the food. Which part of the cell do you think? That means which cell organelle will be responsible for that? Obviously mitochondria, isn't it? You must be remembering that from 9th standard topic. And last step, that is the removal of the carbon dioxide and water, which has been generated during the process of generating energy from the body. That has to be removed. That is known as expiration or else the exhalation. When we classify respiration, that is basically aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So what is aerobic respiration? The process of respiration which requires oxygen, means presence of oxygen is must, then that is known as aerobic respiration. All macroorganisms, all big sized organisms, plants or animals, they undergo this kind of respiration. In this particular respiration, the oxygen is utilized in the cell, and because of that particular reason we can also call this as a cellular respiration. Glucose is broken down, and that is broken down, and waste products like carbon dioxide and water is produced in presence of that particular oxygen, and that carbon dioxide and water has to be removed from the body. Energy will be released, and that energy is not utilized. Every moment or amount of energy is not utilized exactly the same time, but a part of that energy will be stored in our body in the form of ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate. The first equation of aerobic expression, the first part of the equation we can understand is that glucose is converted into pyruvic acid. This is known as glycolysis, and it takes place inside the cytoplasm. Whereas the pyruvic acid then later on will be broken down into carbon dioxide, water, that is in the form of water vapor obviously, and large amount of ATP in the form of energy will be released. All this takes place inside mitochondria. Oxygen is necessary for this particular process. So this is the equation that we can write it down, that glucose converted into pyruvic acid by glycolysis, and pyruvic acid in presence of oxygen in mitochondria broken down into carbon dioxide, water vapor, and lots of amount of energy. Anaerobic respiration. Now this is the mode of respiration which does not require any oxygen. That is why not aerobic, that means anaerobic respiration. Most of the bacteria, yeast, fungi, endoparasites, parasites inside the body of the host, muscle cell, they all undergo the method of respiration called as anaerobic respiration. Here glucose is broken down, same as in aerobic respiration also. In aerobic, carbon dioxide and water vapor was produced. But in anaerobic, either ethanol or lactic acid and carbon dioxide and energy is generated. If it is a plant cell, yes, ethanol and carbon dioxide is generated. And if it is an animal cell, lactic acid would be produced at the end of anaerobic respiration. The first stage remains almost same, that is glucose is converted into pyruvic acid. That is taking place of glycolysis in cytoplasm. If it is a plant cell, then that is in say yeast, in absence of oxygen, ethanol, that is C2H5OH, that is ethanol, ethyl alcohol, which is used in making those hard drinks, this ethanol is generated along with carbon dioxide, and little amount of energy is also generated. But if it would have been an animal cell, Then in animal cell, that is in muscle cell, instead of ethanol, lactic acid would be produced, and once again small amount of energy will be generated. So when we classify aerobic and anaerobic, aerobic requires oxygen, anaerobic no oxygen. Aerobic takes place in most of all the macro animals and macro plants. Here bacteria, yeast, fungi, endoparasites and all those things. Glucose is broken down in carbon dioxide and water vapor in case of aerobic, whereas in case of anaerobic, lactic acid in animal cells and ethanol and carbon dioxide in plant cells, that is what is produced. Let us compare respiration in case of plants and in case of animals. That is respiration in plants and animals. In plants, all the parts, roots, stems, leaves, all of them perform respiration. Whereas in animals, we have specific respiratory systems in the body of the animals. Only that system performs the function of respiration. In plants, little transport of gases from one part to the other part takes place. Whereas in case of animals, lots of transportation of gases from one part of the body to the other remote part of the body by circulatory system takes place. The rate of respiration in case of plants is very slow, almost negligible, identifiable. Whereas in case of animals, one can listen to the breathing sound of the animals. So that is, the rate of respiration is very high in case of animals. Because animals require more energy, isn't it, for performing locomotion? Plants do not undergo such locomotion. When we try to understand respiration in case of plants, then we should understand it in roots, in leaves and stems. So first of all, let us understand respiration in case of roots. Roots take up oxygen for respiration. Obviously that oxygen will be available in the form of soil gases, which is trapped between the soil particles, and that is absorbed into the root hairs by the process of diffusion. The root hairs of the roots are involved in this exchange of the respiratory gases. So it is the very small size structure which is responsible for absorbing oxygen from the soil gases. So root hairs are in direct contact with the air of the soil. Ultimately what happens? The extension of the epidermal cells of the root, that means the root hairs, they are in the contact of the soil and they are responsible for absorbing that. Oxygen diffuses into the root hairs, and that reaches to each and every cell of the roots for that particular purpose of respiration. CO2 is also produced in the cell, and that CO2 which is produced inside the cell will move out during the time of respiration, will move out through the root hairs by the same procedure of diffusion, but exactly in the opposite path. So oxygen is absorbed by the root hairs by diffusion. Carbon dioxide also given out by the root hairs by process of diffusion. When we understand respiration in case of stems, then the stems of herbs, they have, that stomata. So the exchange of gases take place through stomata. We know the structure of stomata, two guard cells. There is a pore-like structure in between them. So oxygen from the air diffuses into the stem through that stomata, then reaches to the cell for the respiration. Whereas the carbon dioxide which is produced by these cells will once again go towards that particular stomata. Stomata opens up, carbon dioxide will be given out through that particular stomata. Hard woody stems, especially when we have big woody trees, big plants, then they have lenticles for respiratory gaseous exchanges. Whereas in case of leaves, they have small spores, what we call pores, what we call it as stomata. The exchange of respiratory gases by the process of diffusion. Once again, just like in case of roots, that was diffusion responsible. In case of stems, diffusion was possible. Similarly, in leaves also, diffusion takes place. So this diffusion, that is responsible for the exchange of gases in leaves also. During daytime, O2 goes out and CO2 is taken in. But during night time, CO2 goes out and O2 is taken in. Let us understand human respiratory system. So this is the diagram of human respiratory system. The various parts that we have in human respiratory system are, number one, that is the nostrils, as you can see that it has been shown on the figure. Then the nasal passage. The next one, that is the pharynx. Still the next ones, that is the larynx, also called as voice box. Then the trachea, that is what we call it as windpipe. Then the bronchi, the two parts entering into the the lungs. The lungs, obviously the main balloons of the respiratory system. And lastly, the diaphragm, which helps in increasing and decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. Beginning with the nostrils. We know that the nostrils open into the nasal cavity. Now, one can imagine that why is it so that the passage of the air is given in such a long manner that it enters through the nose, passes through the nostrils, then into the pharynx, then into the larynx, and then into the lungs. Why is it not so that the holes have been provided right over here so that the air can go directly into that? So many reasons for that. Air is drawn into the body through the nostrils. Then it enters into the nasal cavity. We know that. And what happens? The nasal cavity from inside is lined by the hairs and the mucus. The filtering of the air takes place over here. Just imagine the holes would have been over here. Then where do you think the filtering of the air would take place? Also, the temperature of the air outside and inside the body is different. So such a long nasal path that creates the temperature of the air almost similar to that of the body temperature. So the main function of the nasal cavity to purify that particular air. The dust particles and the microbes in the air gets entrapped and in that particular air and the mucus in the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity that enters, supposing an oxygen molecule is entering into this. See, that is the nasal cavity in this YouTube video. And that nasal cavity has hair lining and the mucus, where it is being filtered out. And then the oxygen molecule, let us say that is an imaginary part. That oxygen molecule slowly and gradually from the nostrils enters into the nasal cavity, where it is purified and then it is being moisturized also. From this nasal cavity, it will go into the pharynx. So, it is over here the filtration takes place due to such a mucus structure. There is slimy liquid which entraps the dust particles into it. So, not dirty air, but the clean air can go into the lungs. So, the mucus is responsible for this purification. So, it is this pharynx in which the air will enter. Through both nose also, through mouth also. You know that we can breathe through mouth also. But generally not advisable because purification of air will not take place as efficiently as through nose. The pharynx, it leads to the trachea. That is the structure that is being shown over here. And that structure from the upper opening, it is having a slit-like structure, what we call it as glottis. And this glottis is covered by I'm showing you in the next, there is a lower figure. It is covered by the cartilaginous flap-like structures, what we call it as epiglottis. Now, while swallowing on the food, the glottis will be covered, and so food cannot enter in the trachea. Trachea is also supported by C-shaped cartilaginous rings-like structure. So, it does not collapse even when there is no air in the trachea. The Adam's apple that you see is that is mainly because of the C-shaped cartilaginous rings which is protecting that particular tracheal tube just behind that. The upper end of the trachea that is called the larynx, what we call it as the voice box. That is the position of the voice box over there. Now, in this video, continuing with that, from pharynx, the air will pass through. This is the passage which is being representing the esophagus, whereas this is the passage of the air. When food is consumed by mistake, it should not go into the food pipe. It should go always into the esophagus only. If it tries to enter into the esophagus, supposing there is a valve-like structure, that is the flap epiglottis, which is responsible for closing the mouth. The food morsel, it is being directed towards the esophagus. You can see that the structure of this epiglottis covers this windpipe. This Adam's apple, the movement is observed from the exterior portion, and the food enters into the esophagus. Sometimes some food particle trying to enter into the food pipe will be coughed out of the windpipe, and that is how the entry of the food in the lungs is prevented. The trachea then runs down and it divides into two parts, which we call it as bronchi. And that bronchi then leads into the lungs. So the bronchial portion is this tubular structure which divides into two parts. It further divides into large number of branches and in each of the lungs, as you can see in this particular figure. The smallest of the bronchial will attach itself, will terminate, will end into the alveoli sac. And this alveoli sac, as you can see in this figure, this alveoli sac is enriched by lots of amount of blood capillaries. It is over here the exchange of the gases take place. So, from larynx, that is the voice box. Now, this is the function of the epiglottis. Here, the cartilaginous flap, what we call it as the epiglottis, that is where when air is being going in, at that it is completely wide open. When it is trying to come out, it vibrates. See the vibration. And that vibration causes the development of the sound. We are capable of developing such a large variety, large frequency sounds. So our language has developed on a great deal. So it is through this trachea. Then our imaginary molecule will pass through the tracheal tube. And then it will pass into the two parts developed, that is the bronchi. Let us see on one of the parts. Over here, the bronchia is being branched into large number of the bronchioles. Each of the bronchial that will terminate itself, the last point of that bronchial, obviously would be the alveoli sac. This is the imagination or the animation of the alveoli sac where the bronchiole will be ending. Now, the exchange of oxygen is going to take place. The white fumes represents the oxygen which is being absorbed by the blood vessel. Whereas this bluish fumes that is being given out, that is carbon dioxide. See the change in the color that has been represented in the animation after absorption of the oxygen. So, the oxygen is being taken out, carbon dioxide is being given out by the blood capillary in contact with the alveoli sac. So that is how the exchange of the gases take place in the human respiratory system. Physical respiration. When diaphragm and the ribs, that is the thoracic cavity, is protected by the ribs, you know that, isn't it? When the diaphragm, that is the muscular flap, the end portion of that particular respiratory system, that contracts, volume inside the thoracic cavity increases. That means it is going to go down and the thoracic cavity, the volume is going to increase. At that particular point, air pressure decreases inside the chest. And therefore, the air pressure being higher from the outside rushes the air into the lungs. This is inspiration or else the inhalation. The alveoli get filled with oxygen-rich air due to that. Exchange of the gases take place. We saw that just now, isn't it? Now what happens? The diaphragm moves up. Diaphragm moves up means it relaxes. That means the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases. Decreased volume means increased pressure. Pressure inside the thoracic cavity or in the lungs is very high as compared to the pressure outside in atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide air which is rich in carbon dioxide is given out through the nostril. Expiration, that is exhalation. Let us try to understand this thing through a video that was uploaded by Tutor Vista on YouTube. As you can see, during inspiration, the diaphragm contracts, moves down, and as you can see, the thoracic cavity volume increases. So the air enters inside the lungs, and therefore inhalation takes place. But during expiration, the diaphragm moves up. Moving up, that means there is a decrease in the volume of the thoracic cavity. And due to that, the air which is rich in carbon dioxide is being given out. So that is expiration or exhalation.